Well, thank you so much, Scott. Yeah, it's 5 years that I've been speaking at this illustrious conference. I really think this is one of the best conferences for me to speak at. I really enjoy it because it gives me the opportunity to dig into different concepts, different ideas in safety. And so absolute pleasure for me. A quick background about SAFEmap. I was born and raised in South Africa. That's where I studied, qualified as a psychologist, went into HR at first, and then I started working in safety. I started SAFEmap in 1994 in Australia, where I spent about 15, 17 years working in the field of risk management, safety, and then I moved to Canada, and I then started focusing here on establishing our business around the world. And we have got a whole range of companies now that are directly linked with us, sister companies, partners, and we have a really significant range of clients everywhere in the world. You see there some big names in our organizational reach that we help and that we support. And this is our team. This is some of these team members are full-time for SAFEmap. Others are partners, 80% of their lives, etc. But this is the world of SAFEmap, and we focus on two areas. One is the human factor in safety and risk-taking behavior, as you'll see in that picture. And the other one is the risk factor in safety, understanding risk from a different angle. And I'll share some ideas and some issues with you today, what we do in this field. So my presentation is going to start 600 years ago. This is in the year 1450, 1400s, when the French and the English were having a big fight. Well, this fight took them 100 years to resolve. Can you imagine having a war for 100 years? That's one thing we've improved upon much these days, isn't it? We've sorted that out. Our wars last only a couple of years at worst. But this one went for 100 years. And one of the ways in which this was happening, it also evolved military ideas and technology. And this is how they started the fighting. This is how they would just bash each other with swords in the middle of a field until the winning match emerged. Basically, the team with the most men standing at the end of the fight. Well, the French started coming up with the first strategic focus on risk. How can we beat the English? So they put men on horseback, and they gave them long lances, and these guys would rush at one point into the battlefield, and they would knock the English soldiers off their feet or try to kill them, and in this way they would get the upper hand. Now, clearly the English didn't like this. They started losing fights. So they decided they're going to have archers roaming the edges of the battlefield. And these archers' job was to shoot these guys on horses before they can get into the battle. That started working. The English started winning the fight, and the French sat down in their camp one day and they started thinking, and they said, what can we do? And one guy came up with a brilliant idea. I think this was a safety suggestion box that he put this in on a tree. And he said, why don't we put these horsemen armor on them? So at that stage, it was leather armor. So they put these armor together, and it started working. The guys the English guys with the arrows couldn't shoot through this. So they decided to do this. They worked. It worked really well. Fight after fight, they started winning. The English said, what can we do? We have to shoot through this leather armor. They came up with the missile of the time, the Tomahawk missile of the time. And that was the sharp-edged arrow in the longbow with a steel tip, a sharp steel tip that would penetrate the armor-penetrating missile. And they started winning. Fight after fight. The French, well, what can we do now? And obviously, what's the next step? metal armor. And they started carving these things out, molding them, and they created an armor for these soldiers. It was amazingly effective. It was the final battle. Well, it turned out to be the final battle at Agincourt, 1415 AD, and the battle was raging. And the French commander said to his French soldiers on horseback, says, "Mount the horses." And nothing happened. They didn't mount the horses. What's going on? Well, we can't get on. We can't move. This armor is too heavy. And they started helping each other on the horses, hoisting each other up with ropes. And eventually they sat on the horses ready to go into battle. And as they were running into the battle, the English guys started shooting them, but their arrows don't go through this metal armor. And they yelled back to their commander, "We can't shoot them. They have got metal armor." And the commander said, "Shoot the horses." And the Anglo started shooting the horses. The horses didn't have any armor on, and the horses threw these guys off. And they were lying on the ground, and the French came in, and the English came in, and they chopped the French soldiers on the ground, chopped their heads off, killed them, and they won decisively. They won the battle, and they won the French throne on this day. And why did the French lose this fight? Now, there's a very fundamental root cause here, and that is they were paralyzed by their protection. Now, that is a very, very important aspect. They were paralyzed by protection. Now, this phenomenon has been permeating the safety industry, the safety profession, the safety thinking, the safety systems of organizations. As we were introducing protection, things started to go a little bit off the rails sometimes. And it wasn't quite that noticeable. But as time went on, more and more people started focusing on this. And the concept of risk homeostasis evolved. Now, what is risk homeostasis? The other word for this is risk compensation. Well, to give you an example, this is from the author who first made this concept more public. And what he did was he tried to explain what happened in Sweden. In Sweden, in 1967, a strange event happened. The Swedish was the only country in Europe that was driving on the left-hand side of the roads. And they decided they have to be more like the rest of Europe, all on the right-hand side. So they decided to switch over. Now, how do you switch over? You can't switch over Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to see if it works. It has to be a clear cut. Everybody moves over to the other side, the wrong side of the road together. Well, they decided they're going to make this happen on the 3rd of September. It was announced, and it was being prepared. People were warned, on that day, you're going to come out on the wrong side of the road. So that night, during the night, they changed everything across Sweden. They changed the signs to the other side. Everything was changed. And that morning, everybody came out and started driving on the other side. Now, what happened that morning? Well, here's a photo of what happened that morning. It was damn near chaos. Well, not really chaos, it was just a standstill. People were standing around and don't know what to do. Where do we go? What do we do? How do we deal with this? And it took a couple of hours where people were standing around and cars were not moving, and then it started moving. And people started getting into this, moving on the wrong side of the road, and it started to become normal. Now, here's what happened. On this time, before 1967, that's where the accident rate on the roads were at. And suddenly, from that day onwards, it started dropping and dropping and dropping dramatically. And the accident rate stayed low for 18 months, 2 years. It was amazing. But then what happened? Well, it started increasing again. And it increased and increased until it reached nearly the level it was before and stayed there. Very much gradually improving, but Why was this strange dip in safety performance happening on the roads? Well, this was explained by Gerald Wild, or Gerard Wilde. He's a Dutchman from Toronto, I think it was Queen's University, where he's published this work, Target Risk, a new psychology of safety and health. Now, this is in 1998 already, so it's quite old now, but it is a concept, and you'll see this in a bit more detail, that people are quite skeptical about. Sometimes there is evidence for it in experimental designs, sometimes there isn't. So it is a strange concept, but it explains, in hindsight, some interesting things about human behavior. Now, I want to combine his work with another great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Now, Daniel Kahneman came up with this concept that we have two modes of thinking. Fast thinking, if I say 8 plus 4, 12 is the answer, fast thinking. This is the emotional, error-prone mode of thinking. This is where risk lives. Then there's the slow thinking mode. If I say to you, 3 times 9 plus 5 minus 4, add that in, and you have to now go into slow, calculative thinking, rational thinking, and deliberate thinking. And this is where safety lives. Now, this is a very important distinction, because in this mode, if we have a long period of no accidents, we are quite a safe performance. This starts to develop a perception of no threat or low threat. And now the two modes of thinking start to operate. And eventually the fast thinking modes start to take over, because things are going well, there's no accidents, I'm driving well, etc. And then this creates balancing behavior. And this balancing behavior then influences my risk-taking behavior. I start taking more risk. Now, after they've had that period of switch over, long period, no accidents, then they started taking more risks again. And they started getting rewards because they get to places quicker, and the accident rate increased. This is a thermostat in the human. And I know this is a total oversimplification. Don't tell me afterwards, this is too simplistic. It is simplistic, but I'm trying to work with these concepts that we make them workable. It becomes a short-circuit process. This simple balancing act, risk-taking reward, is very quickly then established in our minds, until there's an accident. And suddenly the perception of threat is high, and now slow thinking steps in, and the balancing behavior, I take less risk, and I get less rewards from that, and now the risk-taking is reduced. Now, we don't necessarily have to have accidents to tell us this, that there is a threat. Risk perception can do that, the perception of risk. And here's a little example of the difference between actual consequence, actual accidents, and perceived consequence. The human mind very, very quickly learns. And this is what plays a role in perceived consequence like this, where at the Pulpit Rock in Norway, no one has ever been killed by falling over the cliff edge of that rock, because there's a perceived consequence that's very real. There's no fence. Don't go near it. As against at the Grand Canyon, where there's lots of fences everywhere, and the average fatals is 12 per year in the Grand Canyon. Now, this phenomenon of risk homeostasis plays out in various different ways. Interestingly, experiment done with these guys, the cyclists, with or without a helmet. If a cyclist wears a helmet, cars drive, 23% more vehicles come within 1 meter of that bicycle. If the person does not wear a helmet, and especially if it's a woman, because of long hair as well, and people tend to steer clear from that car. Why is this happening? It is the perception of consequences. In Sydney, interesting, in Australia, they started banning texting. So if they see you texting on the roads, you'll be fine. So what do people do? Well, they started holding their phones down below so they can't be detected, and the risk is now actually increased. Now, this is examples of this phenomenon of the thermostat. If you look at human behavior, we can break rules or follow rules, we take risks or act safely. And in this zone, that's where speeding happens, drink driving, fatigue. Now, that's where we focus on in road safety. But if you look at act safely and follow rules, drive at or under the speed limit, cross at pedestrian crossings, that's called the 85th percentile in traffic science. Why? Because the majority of accidents happen in the safe zone. The majority of pedestrians are killed in pedestrian crossings. Because of what? Well, it's because of risk homeostasis. There are sources of paralysis. Protective systems and controls provide or induce this paralysis of the risk thermostat. Behaviors like this, behaviors as a result of perceived protection, when people start to increase risk-taking behavior. And here's an example. Watch what happens. I'll go through, doesn't even touch anybody, because people have this perception of risk as under control, and some people start to induce or lose that perception, that risk control over their actions. The people here are in a slow thinking mode. That guy is in the risk-taking mode. Now, there are various sources of this paralysis, and I want to just go through them. Technology for protection. We have a big focus on technology, safety technology coming through various areas in business. I have had the opportunity to actually see this live happening in front of my eyes. I was living in Australia when a company asked me to introduce proximity alert systems. They were a road building company. They had employees killed. A multi-roller ran over a person, and they asked me to put a proximity alert system. And I actually called it Smart Guard, and I was very impressed with my design. Here's what happened. There was a receiver on the roller, and there was transmitters on the vests of the workers. And before this installation, and this was done in Brisbane, and we had a whole crew for almost 8 months building a tunnel where we could do this and experiment with this. And here's what I noticed. Before the crew, before the system was installed, the workers would look back all the time for the roller, watching the roller coming closer. And if the roller approaches, they would move forward. They also had a spotter standing there. His job was to look at when it gets too close. This is what happened. A person got killed. So what happened when I put my system on? Well, this is what happened. The workers stopped looking back. They only looked forward. They waited for the alarm to go off because there was a loud alarm on it. And even the spotter was deemed unnecessary. So what happened? There was an increase in risk propensity. I've even seen this in action in a coal mine in South Africa a few years ago, where a worker had this on, and I said to him, how does this work? He says, fantastic. He showed me how it works. He walked, I promise you, he walked in front of the shuttle car as it was approaching. And he said, watch. And before I could stop him, he walked right in front of the shuttle car, and the shuttle car stopped. And he says, look, amazing. And his life was not threatened. But what if something went wrong? What if that signal was disturbed? He was now dependent on this. And this is the unfortunate consequence of systems. The resources we devote to increase safety has an effect on safety, on accidents. First, people would ignore, then they would observe, then they would adhere to the rules, compliance, and then we're at a maximum level of control. But then, as we get to this Titanic curve, things get suddenly worse. See, things go not south, they go north if it's accident rates. The more protection we put on, we move into the zone of risk homeostasis, and we move into what I call risk atrophy, where because we don't use the systems anymore, risk systems in our minds, they become completely lifeless. They lose their functionality, risk atrophy. And there is a classic example. Our kids today are growing up in societies where they're completely protected. They are so safe. They are always looked after. And this is the result of that behavior. Now, if you think about why is this happening? Because what happens in the normal life? You nearly have an accident. You nearly slip over and fall when you go downstairs. You nearly have a knife cutting you. And the moment that happens, the thermostat kicks in and you are more alert after that. Kids like this, kids today, they grow up and play in rubber carpeted play parks. There is absolutely no chance for them to be injured. If there's kids in a play park, there will be 12 nannies and mothers and fathers around watching, making sure that they don't fall of anything. We do not learn a fundamental skill anymore. And that skill is risk competence. This is what's going absent. And this is another source then of paralysis. But then organizationally, this is all on an individual basis. What happens in organizations? The whole company, they also experience sources of this paralysis as a whole. And one of the most obvious ones is what I call safe washing. Now, you've heard of greenwashing. You remember that Volkswagen was very, very badly exposed for what they were doing. They were actually fiddling with the software on their cars to report less emissions, because the cars need to have lower emissions in North America than what they had in Europe. So when they put the cars on a test bench, the cars would show lower emissions. But what I forgot now all the technicalities. Well, how they discovered this, when the cars go on the road, the emissions are actually higher than what the test would show on the test bench. And this was called greenwashing. Now, we have the same thing to our detriment in safety, and I call that safe washing. Now, a classic example of it is what happened at the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Just listen to what was said.
The tension in every drilling operation is between doing things safely and doing them fast. Time is money, and this job was costing BP $1 million a day. The day of the accident, BP flew several managers to the Deepwater Horizon for a ceremony to congratulate the crew for 7 years without an injury. For 7 years without an injury. 7 years without an injury. For 7 years without an injury.
Now, what happened here? The company, Transocean, worked for BP. Drilling, BP has an enormous focus on safety. The client demands safety. The client demands low accident rates. And this is happening everywhere in the world. So what happens? The contractor, the provider, has to show good accident rates. As simple as that. And they have to hide the accidents away, because there is no ways, for instance, on a drilling rig like this, that they could have drilled there, worked there with several hundred people working there every day for 7 years, and no one had a scratch on them. It is everybody with a half a brain on them would know this is impossible. So how is it then possible that a company can actually engage in this activity and tell this to a client, smart people in a huge organization, hey, we haven't had an accident for 7 years. They must have known this is impossible. BP must have known this is impossible. Any client organization today must know that the data that the contractors provide to them is not possible. So what do? Well, these guys pretended to be safe, and BP pretended to believe them. And this is what we all do. We pretend to believe. I've talked to a guy on a mine site one day, in dozer driver, and I asked him, what is it that you think is the focus on safety from your management? And his words were this: management, when it comes to safety, is lying to us, and we are lying to them. I'll never forget those words. Now, this is safe washing. It had, in some cases, dramatic consequences. This is North Park's mine in Australia. North Park's mine won a very prestigious award in safety in the mining industry at the time. There's the company receiving their award. We conducted a culture survey of the mining industry in Australia. 42 mines participated. And we had the third most positive organization that won this award as part of our database. And then a few months later, this happened.
On the 24th of November 1999, a large underground cave created by a block caving mining method suddenly collapsed at North Park's mine. Pressurized air with entrained rock, debris and other material entered one level with extreme velocity. Somewhere in one level, the air blast struck a utility used by the two drillers that had been working in the area. The drillers, Mr. Stuart Osman and Mr. Colin Lloyd Jones, were hit by the air blast and fatally injured. The air blast travelled further into the decline, encountering another vehicle. This vehicle had two passengers. The vehicle was picked up by the air blast and tossed around the drive. Both passengers were fatally injured.
Now, that first vehicle was completely disintegrated. There was nothing visible of it in the end. It was just pieces of metal. The second one, lower pressure, the people were killed. Now, here's what we went back to that database that we did the survey in before this disaster. Why is it that this positive winning company had this disaster? Well, here's what we found. One of our questions in our data set was this: I'm worried about dangers in my workplace. And this is what we found when we laid it over that database. Where the more positive organizations, the best safety performing organizations, the employees were generally not worried about dangers in their workplace. And on the other end of the scale, they were very worried about it. This is risk homeostasis in action. Now, a very famous event was the Piper Alpha disaster. Piper Alpha was an oil rig in the North Sea, and they have been regarded as the safest oil rig in the North Sea. They actually won a safety competition 6 months before as the best performing, best oil rig in the North Sea. And then in 1988, a fire started and this happened. 167 men killed. Now, on the day, here's what happened. Piper Alpha, 10 o'clock that night, sent out a mayday that there's a fire on Piper Alpha, and the other oil rigs received the warning, Claymore and Tata, but they kept on producing. Piper Alpha shut down their production, and all the oil started returning back to Piper Alpha. And when they were challenged afterwards, why did you not stop production? The response was, because we assumed they'll get the fire under control, because they knew that these oil rigs have got sophisticated firefighting equipment and deluge systems on them. But what they didn't know is that Piper Alpha had their shut off during the day because there were scuba divers during the day. So these are events that happen to organizations like BP, like Occidental Petroleum, like DuPont, like Transocean. These are all organizations that were extremely safe. And then yet, the next day, something seriously went wrong. And I call them near zero organizations. Until the last second, they were organizations that had catastrophic events. What is the characteristics of these organizations? They focused on safety as a core value. They were fixated on compliance and elimination of at-risk behaviors of workers. The safety approach was on technology, audits, and enforcement. They operated advanced risk management systems and achieved low accident rates. These are fundamental issues that are embedded in most organizations, and they create the need for good news and for information that we now want to send into the organization that is positive. We need to create good news stories in organizations, and I'll come back to that. Another area of concern is risk analysis and matrices. Now, this is almost, why would I question this? Every organization are looking at risk in these ways. We have to quantify the risk. We have to look at risk from severity and chance, likelihood. Now, if you look at these kind of indices, just think about what happens here at the top. We do ratings on it's nearly impossible, it's unlikely, there's a notable chance, it's likely, almost certain. It's impossible for anybody to make that choice. What's the difference between likely and notable chance? What's the difference between notable chance and unlikely? And not only this, then we start to make this even more complicated. We put all kinds of new angles on this. And we may even put formulas on this. And we say to organizations, now do a judgment of the risk in your organization. And we come up with these kind of charts. This is creating paralysis because this tells you, look, we have risks in this area. We got to look after them. And this is the risk that we're safe in, etc. In the meantime, that's not what your risks look like. That's what it looks like. They change dynamically all the time. They change in likelihood, in potential impact. They morph, they move around. There is no logic to them being placed like that. And this creates a false sense of confidence that we have got it quantified. Now, there is another source of paralysis, and this is what I call psychological comfort. Now, psychological comfort comes from psychological safety, and here is how it evolves. We put these requirements onto our employees. We want 0 injuries, 0 accidents, 0 harm, 0 tolerance. As we message this down, the focus in the organization, the culture becomes anxious. And then we drive it more, even further. Then we punish at-risk behavior. We celebrate zeros. And if we start to incentivize the absence of accidents, that culture becomes toxic. And this is then what starts to happen. The fear to fail. The fear to fail becomes embedded in the organization. And it becomes a filter where distorted news goes up to the organization or no news at all. And bad news is like Las Vegas. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, and bad news stays down here. And what evolves is what I call risk secrecy. Risk secrecy was very much part of the problem at Piper Alpha. When the manager was challenged afterwards, why did you not know? Of all the things that went wrong in your organization that we discovered so easily, he said, I thought everything was okay, because I never got a report anything was wrong. And that is fundamental risk secrecy. But where are we today? We're now into what we call psychological safety, a powerful, good concept, something I absolutely professed for a long time. And there is great benefits to be generated from. But the dividing line, the dividing line between psychological safety and psychological comfort is razor thin. We start to introduce and we bring in forward into the organization trust, dedication, care, all good things. We cannot deny that this is what we need to focus on. But then what happens? Accident rates, serious accident rates increase. And this is very clearly evident in our data. look what happens in the fatality rate in the United States today. In the last 3 years, and in 2023 again, this is on the increase. We are killing more people per 1,000 now than we have for a long, long time in our industry. Is this a result of this psychological comfort? Well, fear to fail becomes displaced by fear to disappoint. And in fear to disappoint, we still distort the news, but there's a difference now. Bad news does not only stay here, bad news becomes converted to good news. We make sure that good news go up the organization. And this is what is transferred into what I call psychological comfort. Now, this is a graph of an industry that shows the DART rate, injury rate of employees in the various companies. There's 28 in total. And if you look at what happened in the fatality occurrence over that period of time, 34 fatalities. Where did they happen? They happened in the organizations with the lowest DART rate. More fatalities in that sector, that grouping, than the rest of the industry put together. What's going on here? Good news are flowing up organizations, and we have stopped seeing bad news. We focus so much on small things, we don't see the big things coming anymore. Now, as I said, the concept of psychological safety is extremely powerful. It was popularized by Amy Edmondson. It was a concept that existed for a long time. Edward Deming talked about creating a climate, a culture in an organization where people feel free to report things. James Reason talked a lot about it. Many authors talked about this idea. Jamie Edmondson put this together in the term of psychological safety. And here's a quadrant that she has put forward in the latest book, The Right Kind of Wrong, I think it's called. But if you look at two axes, psychological safety is low, psychological safety is high. Performance standards low, performance standards high. In this area, people are apathetic. Performance standards low, psychological safety low. People show up for work. In that area is the comfort zone, she says. People are open and collegial, but not challenged. And they fail to make strides. Over here is the anxiety zone. High performance standards, but low psychological. People don't want to talk up. People don't want to speak up because this is low psychological. People get blamed if things go wrong. The growth, the learning zone is where we have high performance standards and people collaborate and learn in the service of high performance. And they're getting complex and innovative work done. This is a very powerful model. We want to operate in a learning zone. But if the performance standards increase from high to extreme, obviously it shifts to that zone there. And if you replace the psychological safety with actual risk, an environment of high risk and low risk, we now find the learning zone diminished. And in the zones on the right is where we have dangerous work being performed. Scott mentioned I was a platoon commander in my younger days. That's what I looked like on a patrol. At the end of exhaustion, I did some race car driving, some skydiving. Here we go. These are all dangerous activities. And they all fall into those categories. High performance standards or extreme or an extreme risk. Now, in these zones there, things look different. And the first zone I'm after is the zone of the master zone, where people are committed to master new and unfamiliar skills, where risk is high but extreme standards. In that zone, there's what I call the growth zone. People are willing and able to apply new skill sets. And then in the extreme risk and extreme standards is the peak zone. People are able to engage in extraordinary activities and achieve at levels that are beyond their capabilities. I never thought of the things that I did in the military, that I was capable of doing it. But when I was at the end of my exhaustion, we had to go another day, another week, another month. And you learn that this is peak zone performance. And there's a book written about this, a book in New Zealand many years ago, where the authors looked at the best performing sporting teams at the time around the world. The Chicago Bulls, the 49ers, soccer, Williams Racing in Formula One, and the All Black rugby team. Today, those would be replaced by these teams. And the team there in the middle, bottom, the Springboks is the South African rugby team who's had enormous achievements in the last, they've world champions for 3 years, for 3 World Cups now. An unthinkable achievement in rugby. Red Bull had been performing incredibly well. This is the difference between
a stunning first step out of the race for Michael Schumacher.
But possibly explained by how early he's coming in. You can see we've still got 48 of the 57 to go, so he's not even done 10 laps yet before making his first.
1.8 seconds, blink, and yes, you have.
What an enormous difference in performance. Now, Martina Navratilova made a very important statement one day, and she said, I did not train to always get it right. That's growth performance. I trained to never get it wrong. And here's what one of the, and that's peak performance. And here's what one of the New Zealand rugby players, ex-rugby players, said about the Springboks. The rugby players said they know how to win. But more importantly, they don't know how to lose. And that is peak performance. Now, when we look at our performance in safety and risk, we have an enormous focus on control and analysis of risks. What we don't have is enough focus on discovery of risks, because risks are dynamic. And I want to introduce this little layers. The visible side of safety is the hazards, the risk-taking, the incidents that we see. That's the first layer of risk. And that's where we can see the sharks out of the water. But we see the fins, the dorsal fins in the water. Those are the near misses. And that tells us there's risks underneath the surface. And this is where the second layer exists, the potential risks, high potential hazards, PSIF risks, the stickies. These are all in the second layer. At the third layer, we have what I call the far misses. And this is the area of black swans. But I've introduced some more animals here. Purple dragons, green ducks, white slugs, and yellow elephants. And this came out of an exercise activity that I performed, with a company called the Elimination of Fatalities Task Force, where we visited all their sites, over 40 sites across the world, and identified a wide variety of potential far misses. And I'll give you some examples now of what happened in an organization where this was applied. Remember the Piper Alpha disaster? Here are the key things that went wrong. A gas pipeline leaked and ignited. A water deluge system was shut down during the day because there were scuba divers in the water before the fire started. The water deluge system, when it came into operation, was ineffective, and the ventilation doors failed. And that's where most people died. 167 people died from smoke inhalation. Now, an organization in Namibia called Deb Marine, who harvests diamonds off the seabed, we've introduced with them a concept that we call SAFEmap. It's basically a risk discovery process in the hands and the eyes of the frontline employees every day. It's operating on an app, on a tablet. Every day, somebody performs this activity, and here's how it works. It's a rotational role in teams, so every person gets a chance. Next day, another person gets a chance. They do this peer with peer. It's not an observation process. Goes out and engages with another employee, and together they identify the risks. They use what we call the 6Y risk lens. It's a little powerful little tool to search for risk in an organization. They do a risk calculation, and we have a risk calculator built in that is far more effective. For instance, likelihood has got behavioral scales. If you click on any of those buttons, the scale changes. They look at the critical risks in the organization, or the stickies, and they identify this is a potential working at heights issue, for instance, and then they verify the critical risks. We have got the 4 risks, critical risks for each one built in, and they verify pass, fail, applicable or not. Then we do a pulse culture survey. They actually do a quick culture survey with the person they talk to, and they do a leadership assessment. Have you seen any leader do this in the past day? They look at good practices, the supervisor signs off, and they go into a mode of what we call rapid risk reduction. Now, here's what had been identified. Similar to what happened on Piper Alpha. These ships are operating. There's 120 people working on a ship. This is what the Safe Sentry identified one day. He lifted this cable up. It's a power cable that was resting on a pipe. When he lifted it up, he noticed that it was almost shaved through. And this is a compressed acetylene pipe. You can see electrical cables. He has identified a potential catastrophic event. We call that a yellow elephant, discovered. The water deluge system was shut down, and when you look at one observation here, this is what the Safe Sentry observed.
I was conducting a Safe Sentry within the Boilermakers workshop. A big concern I noticed was that the smoke and heat detectors were actually disabled for the day, which is sometimes acceptable if there's a lot of hot work taking place. And I noticed that the 3 detectors that was disabled on the fire detecting panel was still in disabled mode.
That's what we call a purple dragon. Ventilation fires on the Piper Alpha.
This is an excellent observation. All of us in the engine room department has been walking past this vent for years, and we never saw this. You cannot stand high up and try to close something in that position.
And then that we call a white slug. And then the water deluge system was ineffective. When a ship came back from port and maintenance, the Safe Sentry discovered that the firefighting flanges were a different size from the actual hoses on the ship. It would have not worked if they had a fire. Now, this is what we call a green duck. Now, if this had been discovered after a fire had sunk that ship and 120 people killed, this would have been called a black swan. But this was discovered before. And the same way on the Titanic, it's too late to learn from your risks. It's too late to do it then. These are in existence. And this is what the system has delivered in this organization. If you have a look there, 19,000 risks have been identified. 59,000 critical indicators, critical controls had been verified. And what is this doing? It is creating a short circuit between discovery and verification, and it builds into that model of risk homeostasis. It keeps the focus on risk in the organization, and it keeps the whole organization and individuals focused and alert. Now, these are the sources of paralysis in organizations, and they create the paralysis of pretension, the paralysis of protection, the paralysis of perception, and the paralysis of atrophy. And this is what plays into organizations in disasters, but more importantly, when it's still looking good, when it's still nothing going wrong, these paralysis exist in a subtle way, insidiously, in every organization. Now, we need to look at safety differently. And we need to look at random risk discovery to keep that focus in the organization, embedded risk strikes to focus on risks that migrate, dynamic risk profiles because risk is not static. We have to understand what is consequence modeling, focus, consequently understanding what can go wrong in the organization, to develop a respect for failure. We have to have metrics for risk, not metrics for safety. And very importantly, we've changed We used to say failure, or we currently say failure is an option. When we look at, human error is inevitable. Failure is an option. Well, failure is not an option in this process. There are 4 different readiness that we need to prepare for and get established. The readiness for truth, the readiness for risk in the organization, the readiness for competence, risk competence, and most essentially, the readiness to respond to risk. These are, I think, directions for the future. Whether you're a large organization or a small team, if you focus on these 4 things in your team, you will drive the performance of that team to the next level. And Scott, I think before you get nervous, I think that's the end of my presentation, and you can take over.